Okay, so today we're opening up a file that's really quite crucial. It helps understand not just Spain's 20th century, but also, why sometimes, even today, certain criticisms get instantly labeled as foreign propaganda.
Hmm.
We're taking a deep dive into the historical ideology known as National Catholicism.
Right, National Catholicism.
Now, when most people think about European fascism, you know, images of biological racism probably come to mind, bloodlines, maybe Mussolini's black shirts.
Sure, the standard view.
But the sources we've looked at suggest Spain really carved out something, well, totally unique. They defined themselves differently, not by race, but by what they called spiritual purity.
Exactly, that's the key distinction.
So our mission here is to kind of unpack this peculiar brand of political religion.
Right.
What made it tick? Who exactly did they decide were the ultimate enemies?
And crucially, how did they manage to rewrite centuries of Spanish history?
Yeah, how did they rewrite it to fit this vision of spiritual exceptionalism?
Well, what's really fascinating here, I think, is that we're looking at a system built almost entirely on this self-perception of moral superiority, exceptionalism.
Okay.
This ideology fundamentally believes Spain is, well, spiritually uncorrupted, a chosen nation, distinct from everyone else. The sources brilliantly capture this as the myth of purity.
La Cruzada Imaginaria, the imaginary crusade.
Exactly, the imaginary crusade. It functions like a shield, really, against the outside world and any internal critique.
Okay, let's unpack that core identity then. It seems striking that they genuinely rejected comparisons to, say, German Nazism. Why? Why did they feel such an urgent need to define themselves against German and Italian fascism?
Because for them, the real threat wasn't racial, you see. It was moral, theological even.
Ah, okay.
They weren't searching for a master race defined by blood. They were asserting a master identity defined by what they saw as the pure Catholic faith. And this belief in their own purity was so intense, it sort of required them to see decay everywhere else.
So it wasn't just external enemies.
No, not at all. It wasn't enough to believe outsiders were corrupting the world. They had to believe the rot had infiltrated even the highest institutions. We see these accusations, for instance, that the Vatican itself—
The Vatican.
yes, the Vatican had supposedly been contaminated by Masons and communists. This fear of internal corruption, it ran deep. So deep that the historian Ricardo de la Sierva, he wrote a whole book about it called La Infiltración, the infiltration,
Wow.
alleging that Rome itself, the heart of the church, had been effectively taken over from within.
So if your whole political movement rests on this idea of pure spiritual identity, well, that begs the question, doesn't it? Who becomes the essential enemy? Who do you blame for all the world's impurity?
Right. Every crusade needs its target. And for this particular crusade, the primary enemy, historically and often still today, was identified as the Protestant world.
Specifically England and the United States.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
England and the United States.
And what did the Protestant world supposedly represent in their eyes? What was the charge?
Well, basically everything they defined themselves against. They painted British colonialism, for example, as this machine of pure economic and racist predation,
Okay.
Anglo-Saxon capitalism. That was reduced simply to codicia, greed, just pure greed.
Hmm.
And they'd seize on the worst aspects of that history, like the absolute horror of slavery on American plantations, using it as definitive proof of the moral failure inherent in that Protestant Anglo-Saxon world.
So it gave them a kind of moral high ground against their main geopolitical rivals.
Precisely. It's a powerful rhetorical tool.
And this rhetorical battle, it leads us to something really quite stunning in the sources, a sort of rhetorical judo move. If they're claiming spiritual purity, how did they deal with the massive crimes of the 20th century, like the Holocaust? What was the defense mechanism?
This is where it gets, frankly, astonishing. They took the ultimate crime of the modern era, the Holocaust, and actually used it to reinforce their own claimed innocence. The argument went something like this. The Holocaust is so horrific, it proves that only a Protestant culture, or maybe a culture defined by Anglo-Saxon or Germanic secularism and greed, could even conceive of such a crime.
Wow.
Therefore, Catholic Spain, defined by its inherent spiritual purity, could never be capable of something like that. It's just a jaw-dropping mechanism for externalizing absolutely all historical guilt.
I have to pause there. That is truly breathtaking. Blaming the ultimate crime on your chosen enemy as proof of your own fundamental goodness. Okay. But to maintain this spiritual shield, they had a big problem. Their own history. Spain ran a massive empire, and empires, well, historically they involve violence, resource extraction. How does National Catholicism square that circle? How does it justify its own historical record?
Simple. They completely reinvent it. erase the problematic parts.
So in this new narrative, the Spanish Empire wasn't about sequoia looting or violence.
Not at all. It's presented as a clean slate.
Instead, the narrative transforms the empire from, a colonial project into a mission civilizadora, a civilizing mission.
Exactly.
So it wasn't about gold, it was about evangelization, spreading the faith, and even mestizaje, racial mixing.
Precisely. And this is where that defense mechanism we talked about kicks in with full force. According to this myth, any accusation of colonial brutality, anything feeding into that international image, the Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend.
Right, the Black Legend.
It's all dismissed. It's simply inventions of the Protestants.
Yeah.
Propaganda designed specifically to undermine and destroy Spain.
So Spain only gave good things, culture, language, religion.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
Spain only gave. It never took unjustly. Any suggestion otherwise is enemy propaganda.
But how could that belief hold up against, historical reality? Wasn't there any internal pushback on rewriting centuries of pretty well-documented colonial violence?
Well, the narrative is powerful because it taps into centuries of deeply felt resentment. Our sources show this ideology really grew out of historical pain.
Such as?
Things like the Inquisition's repression of early Protestants, which created lasting bitterness. And then combine that with the slow, frankly agonizing decline of the Spanish Empire as it was gradually overtaken by the rising Anglo-Saxon powers.
Okay.
This created a potent, self-justifying story. We didn't fail because of our own mistakes or limitations. No, we failed because we were betrayed, undermined from outside and within.
So, building on that sense of betrayal, what were the key historical moments this ideology points to?
Right.
Not as inevitable change, but as these malicious internal betrayals.
They really focus heavily on the 19th century as a period of disaster caused by betrayal. The biggest wound, perhaps, was the independence of Hispano-America.
Right, the loss of the colonies.
But in their view, this wasn't a legitimate process of emancipation of nations coming into their own. No, it was framed as a rebellion masonica, a Masonic rebellion.
A Masonic rebellion, supported by whom?
Allegedly supported by Spanish liberals, collaborating with foreign Masons, the English, the French, the Americans, and all linked back to this domestic symbol of betrayal, which was the liberal Constitution of Cadiz from 1812.
Ah, the first Spanish constitution. Why was that seen as such a betrayal?
Because it represented everything the traditionalists hated. It was the first real attempt at Spanish modernity, at establishing democratic rule, inspired by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Lightning rod stuff.
Okay. And then there's the figure of King Fernando VII. He's often called the traitor king, the Rey Felon.
Yes.
What made him the ultimate traitor in this narrative, or perhaps viewed differently by others?
Well, after Napoleon's defeat, Fernando VII came back. And what did he do? He abolished that Constitution of Cadiz. He violently repressed the liberals and the Masons who had supported it.
Right.
Now, from the National Catholic perspective, maybe he wasn't the traitor. Maybe the liberals were.
Mm-hmm.
But the effect, historically, was that Spain essentially missed the train.
Missed the train.
Yeah, missed the train of the democratic revolutions that were transforming the rest of the West. This choice, this repression, led Spain into a state of immobilismo, immobility, stagnation, which, ironically, the conservatives then often blamed on the very liberals they'd crushed.
It's a fascinating pattern. Every internal step towards modernity gets reframed as some kind of foreign-backed conspiracy or betrayal.
Exactly.
Which brings us then to the disaster of 1898. The loss of Cuba, the Philippines, the last real jewels of the empire. And the trigger, the USS Maine exploding in Havana Harbor.
And here we go again. The conspiratorial worldview just takes right over. The dominant belief wasn't that the U.S. military was stronger or that Spain was declining. No.
It was.
The belief, pushed hard by some sectors, was that the main explosion was actually a U.S. self-attack.
Yeah.
It's a false flag operation, meticulously designed purely to justify war and finally finish off the Spanish Empire, orchestrated by those Anglo-Saxons.
So the takeaway from all these historical defeats for these ideologues is that Spain is never actually at fault. It's never internal failings. It's always an outside job. Spain is the eternal victim.
That's the core of the victim narrative, yes.
Okay, so if the U.S. and England were the clear Protestant enemies, where did France fit into this? It's Catholic, but also different.
France. Yeah, France occupies this really awkward, ambiguous spot. It's Catholic, true, at least historically, but it's also the cradle of modern laicism, secularism.
Right, the separation of church and state.
And the birthplace of so much modern, progressive political and social thought. Plus, historically, a major center for European Masonry. This potent mixture makes France a constant suspect, a source of ideological contamination.
And this ambiguity means France gets targeted in what the sources even call delirious conspiracies.
Absolutely. You see it pop up again and again. A more modern example the sources mentioned is after the 11M train bombings in Madrid in 2004.
The Al-Qaeda attacks.
Yes, but almost immediately, some ultra-conservative Spanish sectors started floating theories, pointing fingers not at Islamist terrorists, but at, believe it or not, French Masons, blaming them for orchestrating the attacks.
That really shows the persistence of that conspiratorial mindset, doesn't it? Blaming the familiar bogeyman.
It does. The pattern repeats.
And it wasn't just about foreign enemies, was it? This ideology also had to grapple with deep internal conflicts within the Catholic world itself.
Oh, definitely.
Particularly the challenge posed by liberation theology in Latin America back in the 70s and 80s. You had Jesuits and other clergy supporting the poor, sometimes even joining guerrilla movements.
Yes, and this was a direct challenge, a huge threat to the kind of conservative social and political order that National Catholicism demanded and represented.
So how did they react? Where did they place their allegiance within the church?
Unsurprisingly, they aligned themselves firmly with the conservative Vatican position, particularly under Pope John Paul II, which actively sought to repress liberation theology.
So spiritual purity was okay, but only if it towed a strict political conservative line.
It seems that way. The purity they valued was fundamentally about political and ideological compliance, not just theological orthodoxy in a vacuum.
And we see the horrifying consequences of this clash, tragically, in events like the 1989 assassination of 6 Jesuit priests, including the prominent theologian Ignacio Ellacuria in El Salvador.
Killed by military forces that were aligned with that established conservative political order, precisely because of their work with the poor, inspired by liberation theology. It starkly demonstrates the political stakes involved in defining purity.
So this brings us back around to the present day, in a way. The ongoing struggle against the leyenda negra, the international image, fair or unfair, of Spain as the land of the Inquisition, repression. The stake that struggle seems to be continuous fuel for the extreme right, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. National Catholicism and its ideological descendants interpret the Black Legend not as, historical critique or even exaggeration based on real events, but purely as propaganda.
Propaganda diffused by whom?
By the Protestant powers, naturally, aimed at destroying Spain's reputation and legitimacy. This dictamism is incredibly self-sustaining because it allows them to reject any form of self-critique.
If you can externalize all the guilt,
then you achieve spiritual purity almost by default.
Yeah.
You're inherently innocent because the fault always lies elsewhere.
So, wrapping this up, what's the ultimate takeaway here? We've kind of dissected this unique form of fascism, one based on spiritual purity, propped up by massive historical rewriting, the whole civilizing mission idea, and really defined by centuries of resentment, Masons, Protestants, progressives. The central paradox seems to be a political movement claiming this high ground of spiritual purity, but actually fueled almost entirely by, hate, resentment, and this obsession with conspiracies.
That sums it up well. In their narrative, Spain is never guilty. Spain is always the victim.
The sources state this narrative has been intensely revitalized, amplified in recent years, notably through, and I quote, armies of trolls on social media.
Well, armies of trolls, really?
Yes. So this isn't just preserving history. It's a conscious, modern, often aggressive effort to shape public perception, counter other narratives, and push their pure nation myth online.
It shows how relevant this is, how historical narratives are still fought over today.
Absolutely. And that's the enduring power of this ideology, isn't it? It's a structure that constantly looks backward to justify present-day political aims.
Precisely. And maybe that leaves an important question for you, the listener, to think about. How does any ideology, anywhere in the world, maintain its power and justify actions that might otherwise seem unacceptable? Often, it's by constantly framing itself not as the aggressor or even as responsible, but as the eternal target, the perpetual victim of foreign plots and machinations.
That global pattern of using national victimhood myths.
Yeah, that narrative where your nation, your group can fundamentally never be wrong. That's certainly something worth exploring much further, I think.